It's senior year, and I'm standing in a room that no longer feels like mine. The rain has been falling for hours now, each drop finding its way down the window in slow, deliberate trails that catch the amber light from the quad below. Those lights used to comfort me. For years of late nights studying, for years of watching other students cross the courtyard in groups, laughing about things I never quite understood. Tonight, they just make everything look blurred and distant, like I'm seeing the world through water. I hold the hoodie against my chest, feeling the weight of it in my hands. Navy blue, faded now in places where it's been worn too much, washed too many times. The fabric is soft in that particular way that only comes from years of use, years of being lived in. I lift it slowly to my face and breathe in, closing my eyes against the familiar scent that still clings to the fibers. It doesn't smell like laundry detergent anymore. It hasn't for a long time. 3 years. That's how long it's been since this all started, since everything changed in a way I'm still trying to understand. I can still see Clay the way he was that first night, hair dark and dripping from the shower, a towel slung carelessly around his shoulders. The memory plays in my mind with perfect clarity, the kind of detail that only comes with moments you've replayed 1,000 times. He had walked into our dorm room without knocking, which was typical for Clay even then. Everything about him was easy, natural, like he belonged wherever he happened to be. I was sitting at my desk, probably reading, probably trying to disappear into whatever book could take me furthest from the awkwardness of freshman year roommate dynamics. "Mind if I grab this just for tonight?" he had said, and he was already reaching for the hoodie draped over the back of my chair. Not really asking, not really demanding either. Just Clay being Clay, assuming the world would bend slightly to accommodate him, and somehow always being right about it. I didn't protest. I should have, maybe. It was mine, after all. I had brought it from home, one of the few things that felt familiar in a place where everything was new and uncertain. But something about the way he asked, or maybe didn't ask, something about the casual intimacy of the gesture, left me speechless. So I watched him pull it on, watched how it fit differently on his broader frame, how the sleeves came up short on his arms. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that this would become our ritual. Not every night, but often enough that I began to anticipate it. Often enough that I started leaving it in the same place, draped over the same chair, like I was preparing for him without admitting it to myself. Often enough that the hoodie stopped feeling entirely like mine and became something else, something shared and undefined and complicated. I open my eyes now, for years later, and look around this room that will soon belong to someone else. The walls are bare except for the pale rectangles where my posters used to hang. My books are packed away in boxes. Everything is ready for departure except this one piece of clothing that I can't seem to let go of, can't seem to fold away with everything else. Standing here on the edge of graduation, holding this hoodie that has somehow become the center of something I still don't fully understand, I realize that I've been afraid. Afraid of what it meant when he wore it. Afraid of what it meant when he returned it. Afraid of the way my heart would race those nights when he would appear in the doorway, looking for something warm, something that smelled like me, though I never let myself believe that was what he was really looking for. The rain continues its quiet percussion against the glass, each drop a small reminder of how many nights I've spent in this room, waiting for something I couldn't name. I pressed the hoodie closer to my chest, feeling the echo of all those nights when it wasn't mine at all, when it belonged to the space between us, to whatever it was we were too afraid to call by name. I remember how he looked that first night, water still beating on his shoulders, completely unconscious of how the simple act of asking to borrow my clothes would unravel something in me that I'm still trying to understand. There was no calculation in it, no awareness of boundaries being crossed. Just Clay, cold and slightly shivering, reaching for the nearest source of warmth without thinking twice about what it might mean. But I thought about it. God, how I thought about it. Even as I nodded my silent permission, even as I watched him settle into my hoodie like it had always belonged to him, I felt something shift inside me. Something that made the room feel smaller and larger at the same time. Something that made the ordinary act of sharing clothes feel weighted with possibility and danger. Now, 3 years later, I stand here holding the same piece of fabric, and I can trace every thread back to that moment. Every night he wore it. Every morning he returned it, folded and warm. Every time I caught myself breathing it in afterward, searching for traces of him in the cotton. Every time I told myself it didn't mean anything while knowing, deep down, that it meant everything. The lights from the quad flicker through the rain-streaked window, casting shifting shadows across the walls of this room that has held so many of our silences, so many of our almosts. Tomorrow I'll leave this place behind, but tonight I'm still here, still holding on to the one thing that connects me to all those moments when we came so close to saying what we were both thinking, what we were both feeling, what we were both too scared to name. The hoodie is warm in my hands, warm from my own body heat, but I can almost imagine it's warm from him, the way it used to be on those mornings when he would hand it back to me with a small smile and eyes that said things his mouth never did. I close my eyes again and let myself remember, let myself feel the weight of all those unspoken words, all those careful distances we maintained even as we shared something as intimate as clothing, as scent, as the quiet space between sleeping and waking. This is how love stories begin sometimes. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with small offerings. A hoodie borrowed on a cold night. A trust given without question. A ritual that grows quietly in the spaces between what we say and what we feel, until one day you realize that something ordinary has become extraordinary, that something borrowed has become irreplaceable, that something shared has become the foundation of everything you don't know how to say. I suppose I should explain how we ended up here, Clay and I, in this strange dance of borrowed clothes and unspoken understanding. When I first arrived at college, I was exactly what you'd expect from someone who spent high school with their nose buried in books. Ezra Monroe, 21 now but 18 then, English literature major with a tendency to disappear into headphones and corner tables in coffee shops. I preferred the company of fictional characters to real people, found solace in the predictable rhythms of iambic pentameter, trusted words on a page more than words spoken aloud. I was meticulous about everything. My side of the dorm room was organized with the kind of precision that came from years of finding comfort in control. Books arranged by author, then chronologically, clothes folded and put away immediately. A place for everything and everything in its place, because if your external world was ordered, maybe the internal chaos would follow suit. Then there was Clay Jensen, assigned to me by some cosmic joke of the housing department's random roommate algorithm. If I was all sharp angles and careful boundaries, Clay was curves and open doors. Everything about him was easy in a way that I envied and couldn't understand. He was majoring in kinesiology, spent more time in the gym than the library, and owned what seemed like an endless collection of sneakers that he rotated through with the same attention I gave to choosing which novel to read next. Clay called everyone dude, including our 60-something Victorian literature professor, which should have been embarrassing but somehow came across as endearing when he said it. He had this way of moving through the world like he belonged wherever he happened to be, like every space was meant to accommodate him and was better for his presence. What surprised me most was how kind he was. Not performatively kind, not the aggressive friendliness of someone trying to prove something, but genuinely, quietly kind in ways that caught me off guard. He never made me feel like my introversion was something that needed fixing. He never pushed when I clearly wanted space. He just existed alongside me, parallel rather than intersecting, creating a strange harmony I'd never experienced before. Our room became something I hadn't expected, a sanctuary. Clay would come back from practice or classes and pull out his guitar, settling cross-legged on his bed to play soft melodies that filled the space without demanding attention. I would pretend to read, pretend not to be listening, but really I was absorbing every note, every pause, every small sound he made when he was concentrating. Sometimes he would hum along, voice barely above a whisper, and those were the moments when the room felt most like home. We developed rhythms without discussing them. I would wake up early and be gone before he stirred, leaving coffee for him that he never acknowledged but always drank. He would save me a spot in the dining hall when I inevitably arrived late, sliding his backpack off the chair across from him with a nod that said he'd been expecting me. We coexisted like old souls, like people who had been doing this dance for decades rather than months. The hoodie thing started in October, when the New England cold hit with that particular sharpness that cuts through everything you thought would be warm enough. Clay had been at soccer practice, came back to the room with his hair still damp, skin flushed from exertion and the bite of autumn air. I was at my desk, working on an essay about unreliable narrators in Gothic literature, completely absorbed in the way Poe constructed his sense of unease. I heard him rummaging through his laundry basket, muttering under his breath. When I glanced over, he was holding up a damp t-shirt, then a sweatshirt that clearly hadn't dried from the last wash. His soccer gear was scattered across his bed, everything either soaked with sweat or still wet from being hastily thrown in his bag. That's when his eyes landed on my hoodie, draped over the back of my desk chair where I always left it. Navy blue, worn soft from years of wear. The one piece of clothing I'd brought from home that still felt like comfort in this new place. Just for tonight, he said, already reaching for it, already pulling it on before I could fully process what was happening. I watched the fabric stretch across his broader chest, watched him tug the sleeves down over his hands with a small sigh of relief. The hoodie looked different on him, smaller somehow, like it was trying to contain something it wasn't quite built for. He moved to his bed and collapsed onto it with the particular exhaustion that comes after physical exertion, closing his eyes as the warmth settled around him. I tried to go back to my essay, tried to focus on the careful construction of Edgar Allan Poe's psychological horror, but I kept stealing glances at Clay wrapped in my clothing, at the way he seemed to sink into it like it was exactly what he'd been looking for. The next morning, I woke to find the hoodie folded neatly on my desk, still warm from his body heat, smelling faintly of his soap, and something else I couldn't identify, but found myself breathing in deeply when I thought he wasn't looking. He was already up, already in the shower, and when he emerged with a towel around his waist and steam following him into the room, he caught my eye and smiled that easy smile of his. "Thanks, man," he said, and that was it. No big deal. No acknowledgement that anything had shifted, that something small but significant had been shared between us. But then it happened again a few days later, and then again the following week. Not every night, but often enough that I began to notice the pattern, began to anticipate the nights when he would come back from practice or study group, or wherever he spent his evenings, looking for something warm, something comfortable, something that happened to be mine. Each time, he would ask in that same casual way. Each time, I would nod without really deciding to nod. Each time, he would return it the next morning, folded and warm, and somehow different than when he'd borrowed it, like it had absorbed something of him that lingered even after he gave it back. I began to understand that this was how Clay moved through the world, taking what he needed with such natural ease that it never felt like taking. And I began to understand something about myself too, something about the way I wanted to be needed, wanted to provide comfort, wanted to be the person someone turned to when they were looking for warmth in a cold room. By spring semester, something had shifted between us, though neither of us acknowledged it directly. What started as Clay borrowing my hoodie on particularly cold nights had evolved into something more complex, more anticipated. The ritual had its own rhythm now, its own unspoken rules that we both understood without ever discussing them. It wasn't just about temperature anymore. Clay would reach for the hoodie during exam weeks, when the stress of finals created a different kind of cold that regular heating couldn't touch. He would take it on nights when something was clearly wrong, when he'd come back to the room with that particular tension in his shoulders that meant he'd had words with his coach, or his parents had called with expectations he couldn't meet, or he'd simply had one of those days when being Clay Jensen felt like more work than usual. He never explained, and I never asked. The hoodie became our shared language for things we couldn't say out loud. When he needed comfort, he would look at me with a question in his eyes, and I would nod, and he would pull it on like armor against whatever was troubling him. Sometimes he would return it the next morning with a cup of coffee, the good kind from the place off campus that cost too much but tasted like forgiveness. Sometimes he would just fold it quietly on my desk, and the silence would say everything that needed saying. I began to live for those nights. Not just the ritual itself, but the moment before it, when Clay would pause in the doorway and our eyes would meet across the small space of our shared room. There was always a flicker of something in his expression, something unspoken that made my chest tighten and my breath catch. A recognition, maybe, or a question, or an acknowledgement that what we were doing had moved beyond simple roommate courtesy in a territory neither of us knew how to navigate. Somewhere along the way, I stopped wearing the hoodie myself. It no longer felt like mine in any meaningful sense. It lived on the back of my chair, waiting for Clay to need it, and when he didn't, it just hung there like a placeholder for all the things we weren't saying to each other. The few times I tried to put it on, it felt wrong, like I was borrowing something that belonged to someone else, like I was trespassing in my own clothing. Other people began to notice. It's impossible to keep anything truly private in a dorm, where walls are thin and doors are always opening, where everyone exists in each other's peripheral vision, whether they want to or not. Our friends would catch glimpses of Clay heading to class in my navy hoodie, or see him studying in the library wrapped in fabric that clearly wasn't his size, and the comments started small but grew bolder with time. "Look, there goes Clay in his boyfriend's hoodie again," someone would say, and the word boyfriend would hang in the air like a question mark, like a dare, like an invitation to clarify or confirm or deny what everyone seemed to see but us. Clay would laugh it off with that crooked smile of his, the one that could defuse tension or create it depending on the moment. He never corrected them, never said it wasn't like that, never explained that we were just roommates who happened to share clothes sometimes. He would just shrug and keep walking, keep wearing my hoodie like it was the most natural thing in the world, like the assumptions people were making were irrelevant to whatever reality we were actually living. I didn't laugh. I couldn't. Every joke felt like exposure, like someone was shining a light on something I'd been carefully keeping in the shadows. Every comment made my face burn with a mixture of embarrassment and something else I wasn't ready to name, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The worst part was that Clay's non-denials felt like confirmations of something, though I couldn't be sure what. When he didn't correct people, when he just smiled that enigmatic smile and let them think whatever they wanted to think, I found myself wondering if maybe he wanted them to think it. If maybe the assumptions other people were making weren't as far from the truth as I'd been telling myself. The night that changed everything happened in early April, when the weather couldn't decide if it wanted to be winter or spring and kept cycling between both in the span of a single day. I had been at the library until it closed, lost in research for a paper on queer subtext in Victorian literature, which felt like both the most relevant and most dangerous topic I could have chosen given the circumstances of my own life. When I got back to the room, I expected to find Clay at his desk or in bed or maybe not there at all, out with friends or at some party I hadn't been invited to and wouldn't have attended anyway. Instead, I found him curled up on his bed, fast asleep, wrapped in my hoodie like it was a security blanket. He looked younger when he slept, softer somehow, with his hair falling across his forehead and his breathing deep and even. The hoodie was pulled up around his chin, and he had both arms wrapped around himself, holding the fabric close like he was afraid it might disappear if he let go. In sleep, all the easy confidence that defined Clay during waking hours had melted away, leaving something vulnerable and tender that made my chest ache with feelings I couldn't name. I stood frozen in the doorway, key still in my hand, heart pounding so loud I was afraid it might wake him. This felt like seeing something I wasn't supposed to see, like walking in on a private moment even though it was happening in our shared space, even though the hoodie he was clinging to belonged to me. The intimacy of it was overwhelming, the way he had surrendered to sleep while surrounded by my scent, my comfort, my warmth. I could have woken him. Should have, maybe. Could have cleared my throat or turned on the light or simply made enough noise to let him know I was back. Instead, I set my backpack down carefully, slipped off my shoes without a sound, and moved through my nighttime routine as quietly as possible, stealing glances at him every few moments like I was memorizing something precious that might not last. When I finally turned off the lights and got into my own bed, Clay was still sleeping peacefully, still holding my hoodie like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to something good. I lay awake for hours that night, listening to his breathing, thinking about the weight of all the things we weren't saying to each other, wondering what it meant that he needed my comfort even in sleep, wondering what it meant that I wanted so desperately to give it to him. Something changed in me after that night when I found Clay sleeping in my hoodie. Not all at once, but slowly, like ice melting at the edges until suddenly there's water where there used to be solid ground. I started noticing things I'd been carefully not noticing, feeling things I'd been pushing down so far I'd almost convinced myself they didn't exist. I began writing about him, not intentionally at first, but the way thoughts become words when you're not paying attention to the process. It started in the margins of my textbooks, small observations that had nothing to do with Victorian literature or romantic poetry, but everything to do with the way Clay moved through space, the way he existed in the world with such unconscious grace. The curve of his shoulder when he played guitar, the way his voice got softer when he was tired, how he always touched his hair when he was thinking, fingers combing through the dark strands like he was trying to untangle his thoughts along with it. These details found their way into my notebooks, scattered between analysis of Tennyson and notes on narrative structure, like my academic work was being invaded by something more personal, more urgent. Then the margins weren't enough. I started keeping a separate notebook, telling myself it was for creative writing exercises, for character development practice, anything except what it actually was. Pages filled with observations that felt too intimate to be casual, too specific to be innocent. The way Clay's eyes crinkled when he laughed at something genuinely funny versus when he was just being polite. How he always left his guitar slightly out of tune, and the sound of him adjusting the strings had become one of my favorite parts of coming back to the room. I wrote about his hands, which was when I knew I was in trouble. The way they moved across the guitar strings, confident and sure. How they looked holding a pencil, surprisingly delicate for someone who spent so much time in the gym. The few times they'd brushed against mine when we were both reaching for something, and how those moments of contact sent electricity up my arm that I had to pretend not to feel. I caught myself staring at him more often, and not in the casual way roommates observe each other's habits. This was different, hungrier somehow, like I was trying to memorize him without his permission. When he would stretch in the morning, shirt riding up to reveal a strip of skin, I would find myself looking longer than I should, imagining things I had no right to imagine. When he would emerge from the shower with steam still clinging to his shoulders, I would have to force myself to look away, to pretend I was absorbed in whatever book was open in front of me. Every accidental touch became an event. If his arm brushed mine when we were walking to class together, it felt like a storm moving through my nervous system, leaving me shaky and hyper-aware of every inch of space between us. If he leaned over my shoulder to look at something on my laptop, I could smell his shampoo and feel the warmth radiating from his skin, and it took everything I had to focus on whatever he was asking about, instead of the way his presence seemed to fill all the air in the room. But Clay was changing too, in ways that made me wonder if I was imagining things or if something really was shifting between us. He started lingering longer in conversations, asking questions that felt loaded with meaning I wasn't sure how to interpret. Instead of the quick exchanges we used to have about homework and schedules, he would sit on the edge of my bed and talk about bigger things, deeper things, questions that required more than surface answers. His voice got softer during these conversations, more thoughtful, like he was testing the weight of words before he spoke them. He would ask me about the books I was reading, not just the titles, but what they meant to me, why I chose them, what I thought about when I was alone with other people's words. When I tried to deflect with academic analysis, he would shake his head and say he wanted to know what I really thought, not what I thought I was supposed to think. "You ever think about what comes after this?" he asked me one evening in late April, sitting cross-legged on his bed with my hoodie pulled over his clothes like armor against some invisible cold. After us, I mean. After college. The question hit me like a physical thing, heavy and complicated. After us. Not after college, not after graduation, but after us, like we were a unit that existed beyond the circumstances that had brought us together. Like there was an us to consider in the first place. I don't know. I told him, which was true in some ways and completely false in others. I thought about it constantly, about what would happen when we graduated and went our separate ways, when this strange intimacy we'd built around borrowed clothes and shared silences came to an end. The thought of it made my chest tight with panic I couldn't explain to him or to myself. He nodded like he understood something I hadn't said, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of his questions settling between us like another presence in the room. That night, he wore the hoodie to bed and returned it the next morning warm and smelling like sleep, like dreams I wished I could have shared. The tipping point came on a Friday night in early May, when the campus was buzzing with the particular energy that comes near the end of the semester, when everyone is simultaneously exhausted and wired, desperate for summer, but not quite ready to let go of the year. Clay had gone to some party with his soccer teammates, something I was invited to but had declined, preferring the quiet of our room and the company of a novel I was reading for pleasure rather than class. I was deep into the book when I heard fumbling at the door, the sound of someone trying to work a key with less coordination than usual. When Clay finally managed to get inside, it was obvious he'd had more to drink than he usually did. Not sloppy drunk, but looser somehow, like his usual careful control had been softened around the edges. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe like he needed it for support. His hair was messed up and his shirt was wrinkled, and there was something vulnerable about seeing him less than perfectly composed. "You're still up." "I am," I said, closing my book and watching as he made his way unsteadily to his bed. "You okay?" He nodded, but it was the kind of nod that wasn't entirely convincing. "Fine. Just tired. Long night." I watched him struggle with his shoes, and when it became clear he was having trouble with coordination, I got up to help him. He let me, which was unusual for Clay, who was normally too proud to accept assistance with anything he thought he should be able to handle himself. When I knelt down to help him with his laces, he put his hand on my shoulder for balance, and the weight of it sent that familiar electricity through me. "Thanks," he said when I helped him get his shoes off. His voice was softer than usual, roughened by whatever he'd been drinking. "You're good to me, Ezra. Better than I deserve." "That's not true," I told him, and I meant it. He was good to me too, in ways I was only beginning to understand, in ways that went far beyond roommate courtesy. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to focus, trying to find words for something. Then he reached for my hoodie, which was draped over the back of my chair as always, and pulled it on over his rumpled shirt. The gesture was so familiar, so much a part of our established routine, that it felt like coming home. I helped him get settled on his bed, making sure he had water and was lying on his side, all the basic drunk person safety measures I'd learned from orientation programs and common sense. I was about to go back to my own bed when his hand shot out and caught mine, fingers wrapping around my wrist with surprising strength for someone who'd been struggling with his shoelaces minutes earlier. "Stay," he said, and the word came out soft and desperate, like he was asking for something much bigger than just my presence in the room. "Please." I should have said no. Should have gently extracted my hand and gone back to my own bed, maintained the careful boundaries we'd been dancing around for months. Instead, I found myself nodding, found myself sitting on the edge of his bed, then lying down beside him when he tugged gently on my wrist. The bed was narrow, meant for one person, so we lay close together with the hoodie between us like a barrier and a bridge at the same time. Clay was still clutching the fabric with one hand, holding my wrist with the other, and I could feel the warmth of his body all along my side. Could hear his breathing gradually slow and deepen as the alcohol and exhaustion pulled him toward sleep. I didn't sleep at all. How could I? I lay there in the dark, hyper-aware of every point where we were touching, every breath he took, every small sound he made. This was the closest we'd ever been, the most intimate we'd ever allowed ourselves to be, and I knew it was only happening because his inhibitions were lowered, because tomorrow he would wake up and remember and probably regret whatever impulse had made him ask me to stay. But for those hours in the dark, I let myself pretend it meant something. Let myself imagine that the way he held on to me was intentional, that the soft sounds he made in his sleep were for me, that this closeness was something we could have in daylight too. something that didn't require alcohol or exhaustion or the cover of darkness to exist. When dawn started filtering through the blinds, I carefully extracted myself from his grip and went back to my own bed, trying not to wake him, trying to preserve whatever peace he'd found in sleep. When I woke up a few hours later, Clay was already gone, already showered, already dressed, already escaped from whatever had happened between us in the dark. The hoodie was back on my chair, folded with the same careful precision he always used, still warm from his body heat. He'd left no note, no acknowledgement of the night before, no indication that anything unusual had happened. Just the hoodie, returned as always, carrying the scent of him and the weight of everything we still weren't saying to each other. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at it, this piece of clothing that had become the center of something I still couldn't name, something that felt too big and too fragile to examine too closely. The silence in the room felt different than usual, heavier somehow, like it was holding secrets that neither of us knew how to tell. After that night when Clay asked me to stay, something broke loose inside me that I couldn't put back together. The careful equilibrium I'd maintained for months, the delicate balance between wanting and denying, between hoping and protecting myself, had been shattered by those few hours of closeness in the dark. I couldn't pretend anymore that this was just roommate friendship, couldn't convince myself that the way my heart raced every time he reached for the hoodie was anything approaching normal. The weight of my own wanting became unbearable. Every casual interaction felt loaded with the memory of lying beside him, feeling his breath on my neck, his fingers wrapped around my wrist like an anchor. When he would smile at me across the dining hall or ask me about my day, I could hear the echo of his voice saying, "Stay, please," and it made me feel like I was drowning in plain sight. I started pulling away without really deciding to. It began small, with excuses and evasions that felt necessary for my own survival. When Clay would suggest we walk to class together, I would remember something I needed to do first, somewhere else I needed to be. When he would settle in with his guitar for those evening sessions that had become such a cherished part of our routine, I would find reasons to be at the library, at study groups, anywhere that wasn't our room where the air felt thick with everything we weren't saying. I changed my schedule, started coming back to the room later and leaving earlier, timing my movements to minimize the overlap between us. I told myself I was being practical, that I needed space to figure out what I was feeling before I did something stupid that would ruin everything we had built together. But really, I was running from the intensity of my own emotions, from the way being near him made me feel simultaneously alive and terrified. The hoodie became a casualty of my retreat. For the first time since that October night when this all began, I started taking it with me when I left the room, stuffing it into my backpack or wearing it myself. Anything to make sure it wasn't available when Clay might need it. When I was in the room, I kept it in my closet instead of draped over the chair, hidden away like evidence of something I was no longer sure I could handle. It took Clay 2 weeks to notice, which was longer than I'd expected, but not long enough for me to figure out what I was going to say when he finally confronted me about the change in our dynamic. I came back from my American poetry class one afternoon to find him sitting on his bed, guitar forgotten beside him, that patient expression on his face that meant he'd been waiting for me. "We need to talk," he said, and those 4 words made my stomach drop because I knew this conversation was going to strip away whatever illusions of normalcy I'd been trying to maintain. I set my backpack down carefully, bought myself a few seconds by hanging up my jacket, but there was no avoiding what was coming. When I finally turned to face him, Clay was watching me with an intensity one wasn't used to seeing from him, like he was trying to solve a puzzle I'd accidentally become. "Did I do something?" he asked, and the genuine confusion in his voice made this somehow worse than if he'd been angry. "You've been different lately. Distant. I feel like you're avoiding me, and I don't understand why." The direct question hung between us like a challenge, and I realized I had 2 choices. I could lie, make up some excuse about stress or workload or anything else that would deflect from the real issue. Or I could tell him the truth, or at least enough of it to explain why everything had changed. The lie would have been safer. The lie would have preserved whatever friendship we had left, would have allowed us to coexist for the few remaining weeks of the semester without the messiness of feelings that couldn't be taken back once they were spoken. But I was tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of carrying the weight of my own emotions like a secret that was slowly poisoning me from the inside. "What do you think it means?" I asked him, the words coming out harsher than I'd intended. "When you keep taking something that isn't yours." He blinked, clearly not expecting the conversation to take this turn. "I'm not following." "The hoodie, Clay." I gestured toward the closet where it was currently hidden, though we both knew exactly what I was talking about. "What do you think it means when you keep taking my hoodie?" The confusion on his face was genuine, which somehow made this worse. "It's just a hoodie," he said, like that should be explanation enough, like the casual dismissal of something that had become central to my entire emotional landscape was supposed to make sense. But it wasn't just a hoodie, and we both knew it, even if only one of us was willing to admit it. It was 3 years of borrowed intimacy, of shared comfort, of nights when he would wrap himself in something that smelled like me and mornings when he would return it warm with his own body heat. It was every time he'd looked at me before taking it, every smile when he returned it, every moment when the simple act of sharing clothes had felt like sharing something much more significant. "No," I said, and my voice was shaking now with the effort of finally saying what I'd been thinking for months. "It's not just a hoodie. It hasn't been just a hoodie for a long time, and if you don't know that, then you haven't been paying attention." Clay stared at me, and I could see the moment when understanding began to dawn on his face, when the implications of what I was saying started to sink in. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of everything I'd just revealed and everything I was still too afraid to say. I told him then, not everything, but enough. Enough to explain why I'd been pulling away, why I couldn't handle the casual intimacy anymore, why every time he wore my hoodie it felt like he was wearing my heart on the outside of his body for everyone to see. I told him about lying awake that night when he'd asked me to stay, about how being close to him had felt like coming home and losing myself at the same time. I didn't tell him I was in love with him. Couldn't bring myself to use those words, but I said enough for him to understand that this had moved far beyond friendship for me, that what he thought was simple roommate generosity had become something much more complicated and painful and desperate. When I finished talking, the room felt impossibly quiet, like even the sounds from outside had paused to listen to what would happen next. Clay was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between shock and recognition, and something else I was afraid to identify. I waited for him to say something, anything, to fill the silence that was growing more unbearable with each passing second. I waited for him to laugh it off or get angry or tell me I was imagining things that weren't there. I waited for him to do something that would let me know where we stood, what this meant for whatever relationship we had left. Instead, he stood up without saying a word. Just stood up, grabbed his jacket from where it was hanging on his desk chair, and walked toward the door like he couldn't get out of the room fast enough. "Clay," I called after him, but he didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge that I'd spoken. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than if he'd slammed it. I stood there in the sudden emptiness of our room, staring at the space where he'd been sitting, trying to process what had just happened. The silence felt different now, not comfortable like it used to be, but hollow, echoing with the weight of words that couldn't be taken back. I looked toward the closet where the hoodie was hidden, this piece of clothing that had somehow become the symbol of everything we were and everything we weren't, everything we'd shared and everything we'd lost. For the first time in months, it felt entirely mine again, and I realized that wasn't what I wanted at all. The empty room seemed to mock me with its familiarity, with all the small details that spoke of our shared life together. Clay's guitar leaning against the wall, his textbooks scattered across his desk, the indent in his pillow where his head had been just minutes before. Everything was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago, but everything was different now, broken in a way I wasn't sure could be fixed. I sat down on my bed and put my head in my hands, trying to understand what I'd just done, what I'd just lost, what I'd been hoping to gain by finally telling the truth. The afternoon sun slanted through our window, casting familiar shadows across familiar furniture, but nothing felt familiar anymore. Nothing felt safe. The hoodie hung in the closet like a ghost, and for the first time since this all began, I wondered if some things were better left unspoken, if some truths were too dangerous to survive the telling. The weeks that followed were some of the longest of my life. Clay came back to the room that night, but not until well after I'd gone to bed, and when I woke up the next morning, he was already gone. This became our new pattern, a careful choreography of avoidance that felt like a dance we'd learned without ever practicing the steps. We existed in the same space, but in different time zones, ships passing in a harbor that had become too small for both of us. Clay would wait until he heard me leave for my morning classes before emerging from his bed. I would linger in the library until I was sure he'd be asleep before returning to our room. When we occasionally miscalculated and found ourselves face to face, the conversations were brief, polite, and painfully superficial. "How was your day?" became a question with only one acceptable answer. "Fine, thanks. How was yours?" The words felt like placeholders for all the things we couldn't say anymore. Thin coverings over the crater that had opened up between us since that afternoon when I'd finally told him too much of the truth. The hoodie stayed in my closet, untouched and forgotten, like evidence of something that had never really happened. Sometimes I would catch myself looking toward the chair where it used to live, expecting to see the familiar navy fabric draped across the back, but finding only empty space that seemed to mock the routine we'd built and lost. Clay stopped playing guitar in the evenings. The silence in our room felt different now, not the comfortable quiet we used to share, but something hollow and echoing, full of all the words we weren't saying and all the distance we were maintaining. I tried reading to fill the emptiness, but even my favorite novels felt flat and meaningless against the weight of what we'd broken. A week after our confrontation, Clay announced that he was moving out early. He said it like it was a practical decision, something about convenience and graduation logistics, but we both knew what it really meant. We both understood that sharing space had become impossible, that the careful balance we'd maintained for 3 years had been permanently disrupted by my inability to keep my feelings contained. "I'm moving in with Marcus for the last few weeks," he told me one morning when we accidentally crossed paths at the door. His soccer teammate, who lived in the apartment complex off campus. Just makes sense with graduation coming up and everything. The everything carried the weight of our entire unspoken history. All the complexity he couldn't name directly, but didn't need to. I nodded like I understood, like it was perfectly reasonable that he needed to escape the room we'd shared, the space that had held so much of our quiet intimacy and was now suffocating both of us with its memories. "That makes sense," I said, though nothing about any of this made sense to me. Nothing about losing him. Nothing about the way 3 years of careful friendship had dissolved in the space of a single afternoon. Nothing about how I was supposed to exist in this room that would soon hold only echoes of what we used to be. He packed his things over the course of 2 days, and I made sure to be elsewhere during most of it, unable to watch him systematically removing all traces of his presence from the space that had defined us. When I finally returned to find his side of the room stripped bare, it felt like waking up to discover that half of myself had been surgically removed while I slept. His guitar was gone. His textbooks, his scattered sneakers, his collection of coffee mugs from various campus events we'd attended together. The only thing that remained was a faint indent in his mattress and the smell of his shampoo lingering in the air like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. We became strangers after that, which was somehow worse than if we'd become enemies. Enemies would have required acknowledgement, would have meant that what happened between us mattered enough to sustain anger or hurt, or any emotion that proved we'd once meant something to each other. Instead, we developed an elaborate system of not seeing each other, of walking past each other on campus like we were just two people who happened to occupy the same physical space without any shared history. When our paths inevitably crossed in the dining hall or between classes, Clay would nod politely, the way he might acknowledge any casual acquaintance, and I would nod back with the same careful neutrality. No one watching us would have guessed that we'd lived together for 3 years, that we'd shared the kind of quiet intimacy that comes from knowing someone's breathing patterns and sleep habits and the exact sound they make when they're trying not to laugh at something they find genuinely funny. The worst part was how easy he made it look. Clay moved through campus with the same confidence he'd always had, the same easy smile for his friends, the same relaxed posture that suggested he belonged wherever he happened to be. If our conversation that afternoon had affected him the way it had affected me, he showed no signs of it. He looked like someone who had successfully extracted himself from a complicated situation and was relieved to be free of it. Meanwhile, I felt like I was walking around with a wound that wouldn't heal, something vital that had been damaged and wasn't regenerating the way it was supposed to. I threw myself into end-of-semester work, spent long hours in the library working on final papers and projects, anything to avoid the empty room that no longer felt like home, but like a museum of something that had ended badly. Graduation approached with the relentless momentum of something I wasn't ready for. Other students talked excitedly about summer plans, about jobs in graduate school, and the freedom that came with finishing college. I listened to their enthusiasm and felt nothing except the growing certainty that leaving this place would mean accepting that whatever Clay and I had shared was truly over, that there would be no opportunity for repair or reconciliation or even proper closure. The idea of closure felt impossible. How do you find an ending to something that was never officially acknowledged as having begun? How do you grieve the loss of a relationship that existed primarily in the spaces between words, in borrowed clothes and shared silences, and all the things that were felt but never spoken? I was packing my own belongings, boxing up 3 years of college life with the mechanical efficiency of someone going through the motions, when I found the package outside my door. Small, wrapped in brown paper, with my name written in Clay's careful handwriting across the front. No return address, no indication of when it had been left there, just this unexpected offering that made my hands shake as I carried it inside. I set it on my desk and stared at it for a long time before working up the courage to open it. Whatever was inside felt soft, familiar, and when I finally tore away the paper, I found the hoodie. Washed and folded with the same care Clay had always shown when returning it, but somehow different now, charged with finality. Tucked inside the folds was a note, written on the same careful script that had labeled the package. The paper looked like it had been torn from one of his notebooks, the edges slightly ragged, and I could see where he'd started and stopped several times, could imagine him struggling with what to say. "You're right," the note began, and those 2 words hit me like a physical blow because they acknowledged what I'd been afraid he would deny or dismiss. I kept taking something that wasn't mine, but maybe I wanted to give it back differently. I don't know what I'm doing. I just knew it felt like home. It was signed simply with the letter C, as if his full name would have been too much intimacy for what we were now, too much presumption that I would welcome even that small piece of himself. I read the note twice, then again, trying to decode every word, every pause, everything he wasn't saying directly but might have meant. The phrase felt like home echoed in my mind. 3 words that seemed to contain everything we'd never been able to discuss out loud. Home. Not just comfortable or convenient or nice, but home, which implied belonging, which implied something deeper than casual roommate affection. I didn't cry, though part of me felt like I should have. Instead, I just sat there holding the note and breathing, really breathing, for what felt like the first time in weeks. The knot of tension I'd been carrying in my chest since that afternoon, when everything fell apart, loosened slightly, not disappearing, but shifting into something that felt less like panic and more like possibility. The hoodie lay folded on my desk, returned to me, but somehow different now, not just mine anymore, but ours in a way it had never been before. Whatever Clay had meant by wanting to give it back differently, whatever he'd been trying to say with those carefully chosen words about home, it felt like an opening rather than a closing, like a door that had been left slightly ajar rather than slammed shut. I picked up the note again and traced my finger along the words, trying to imagine Clay writing them, trying to picture him standing outside my door with this package, working up the courage to leave it there. The image made something warm unfurl in my chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope, though I wasn't sure what I was hoping for or whether hoping was safe anymore. Outside my window, the campus was preparing for graduation, for the end of one thing and the beginning of whatever came next. The afternoon light slanted through the glass, casting familiar shadows across familiar furniture, but for the first time in weeks, the familiarity felt comforting rather than suffocating. Whatever this note meant, whatever Clay had been trying to tell me, it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was proof that what had happened between us mattered enough to require explanation, apology, or at least recognition. I folded the note carefully and tucked it back inside the hoodie, then held the whole bundle against my chest the way I'd done that night weeks ago when this story began. The fabric still smelled faintly of his soap, still carried traces of him that made me close my eyes and remember all the nights when wearing my clothes had been his way of asking for comfort, and giving it back had been his way of saying thank you. Maybe it wasn't over. Maybe there was still something to be salvaged from the wreckage of our careful friendship. Maybe the note was Clay's way of saying that he understood what I'd been trying to tell him, that he'd needed time to figure out what he felt about it, that the door I thought I'd closed with my clumsy honesty was still open enough for him to slip this small offering through. I sat there as the afternoon faded into evening, holding the hoodie and thinking about home, about what it means to feel at home in someone else's presence, about whether it was possible that Clay had felt the same thing I'd felt all those nights when he'd worn my clothes like they were exactly what he'd been looking for. Graduation day arrives with the kind of perfect spring weather that feels designed for endings and beginnings. The campus buzzes with families and flowers, with the particular energy that comes when hundreds of people are trying to capture something fleeting before it disappears forever. I stand among the crowd of graduates, cap in hand, adjusting my gown in the morning sunlight. Beneath the black polyester, I'm wearing the hoodie. It felt like the right choice when I was getting dressed this morning, though I couldn't have explained why to anyone who asked. Maybe it was Clay's note, those words about home that had been echoing in my mind for days. Maybe it was the need to carry something of our story with me into whatever comes next. Maybe it was simply that after 3 years of sharing it, the hoodie felt like the most honest thing I could wear on a day about transitions and truth. The fabric is soft against my skin, familiar in a way that grounds me as I navigate through the chaos of families trying to find their graduates, professors in their academic regalia, the careful orchestration of several hundred people trying to mark the end of one phase of life and the beginning of another. I'm scanning the crowd, looking for my parents who are somewhere in this sea of faces, when I catch sight of Clay. He's maybe 50 yards away, surrounded by what must be his family, his cap already placed perfectly on his dark hair. For a moment, I consider turning away, continuing the pattern of avoidance we've maintained for weeks. But something stops me, some instinct that says this moment matters, that this is our last chance to acknowledge what we've been to each other before we scatter to different lives in different places. Our eyes meet across the distance, and for a few seconds, everything else fades away. The noise of the crowd, the heat of the sun, the weight of the gown on my shoulders, all of it becomes background to this one moment of connection. Clay's expression is serious, thoughtful, like he's trying to memorize something or solve a problem that doesn't have an easy answer. There are no words exchanged, no dramatic gestures or grand declarations. Just this long, weighted look that carries the history of everything we've shared and everything we've lost and everything we've never quite been able to say. In that look, I see the Clay who used to play guitar in the evenings while I pretended to read. I see the Clay who borrowed my hoodie on cold nights and returned it warm in the mornings. I see the Clay who asked me to stay that night when he was drunk and vulnerable and needing comfort he couldn't name. After what feels like both an eternity and an instant, I nod once. A small movement, barely perceptible to anyone watching, but heavy with meaning between us. It's acknowledgement, maybe. Forgiveness, possibly. An ending that doesn't feel like an ending, or a beginning that doesn't know how to announce itself. Clay nods back, the same slight movement, the same careful weight. His family is calling his name, pulling his attention back to the business of graduation, and the moment passes like all moments do, leaving only the memory of connection and the question of what it meant. The ceremony unfolds with the predictable rhythms of academic tradition. Names called, diplomas handed out, caps thrown into the air with the kind of joy that comes from surviving something difficult and meaningful. I go through the motions, shake hands with professors, pose for pictures with classmates whose names I'll probably forget, but whose faces will linger in my memory as part of this place. This time, this version of myself that ends today. Hours later, after the last photograph has been taken and the last goodbye has been said, I board the train that will take me home. Not back to the dorm that's already been cleaned out and reassigned, but home to my parents' house, to my childhood bedroom, to the space where I'll figure out what comes next in this life I'm suddenly responsible for navigating on my own. I find a window seat and settle in for the long ride. The hoodie now draped across my lap since the day has grown warm and the graduation gown has been folded away in my bag. The fabric is soft under my fingers, worn smooth by years of wear and washing, by all the nights it provided comfort to both of us in different ways. As the train pulls away from the station and the campus grows smaller in the distance, I lift the hoodie to my face one more time. It still smells faintly like Clay's soap, like the particular scent that belonged to him and no one else. 3 years of shared space, of borrowed intimacy, of all the things we felt but never quite found the courage to say, and it all comes down to this. A piece of clothing that carries the ghost of someone else's presence, the memory of warmth that wasn't originally mine. But somehow that's okay. More than okay, actually. The hoodie is mine now in a way it never was before. Mine because it was given freely rather than borrowed temporarily. Mine because it carries the story of something real and complicated and meaningful, even if that something never became what I thought I wanted it to become. Outside the train window, the landscape scrolls by like pages in a book I'm closing. Each mile another small goodbye to the person I was when this story began. But the hoodie remains constant in my hands, soft and warm and smelling faintly of someone who taught me that love doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like, that sometimes the most profound connections happen in the spaces between words, in borrowed clothes and shared silences, and all the small offerings we make to each other without knowing if they'll be accepted or returned. The train carries me toward whatever comes next, and I carry the hoodie, and the hoodie carries the memory of Clay, and somehow that feels like enough. Not the ending I thought I wanted, but the ending that makes sense, the one that honors what we were without demanding that it be more than it was. Sometimes home isn't a place you stay. Sometimes it's something you carry with you, soft and warm and smelling faintly like someone else, proof that you were known, that you mattered, that you were home to someone, even if only for a while.